Okay, so this is our first meeting for first BIC users meeting for 2016. Thanks everybody for showing up. This will cover kind of a basic introduction of basically how to, in layman's terms, look at your data. Or it's the first step in neuroimaging data analysis, obviously. It sounds kind of silly to talk about this, but most people in reality don't look at their data until they've acquired a large amounts of it, which puts a lot of people in a bad space in terms of acquiring a large amount of data and then not knowing what to do with it months or years down the line. So one of the kind of behaviors that we'd like to encourage with neuroimaging at BIC is to pretty much look at your data as soon as you acquire it. And while that may not always be possible practically, we're implementing tools to make that process a lot easier and to basically help users spot major issues early on in the neuroimaging process. We'll have short presentations from Tom Maloney, who will be talking about the REDCap system of data acquisition. Importantly, this is actually kind of demographic data acquisition, and that's an important part of this, and we'd like to introduce that at this meeting. Then we'll talk about the DICOM to NIFTY pipeline that's implemented on XNAT now, as well as Paula Croxson will discuss structural imaging, artifact detection that you can do by eye. I'll be talking about quality control for fMRI using metrics that are now implemented on XNAT. And then we'll kind of wrap up with some general recommendations. All right. Okay, so I think it's important just to kind of give an overview of the point of all this, and that what we're trying to do at Mount Sinai with neuroimaging is go from a model where each user, a postdoc, a research assistant, even a PI or something, in each lab does everything kind of on their own with software installed on their own machine in a kind of non-centralized, non-standardized way. They use the data once, or twice maybe, then they forget about it. That's the end. That's the end of story. So we'd like to move away from that model towards basically a centralized, integrated, server-based approach where automation is used. These are all fun words, but basically what it means is building software and databases that connect people's data at Mount Sinai, not just for the purpose of data sharing, but also for the reduction of redundant efforts, which happens a lot in neuroimaging, where everybody has the same piece of software installed on their machines with the same bugs, but nobody really talks about it. So we'd like to move away from that model and basically solve all the problems in one place so people can actually focus on their science. Right, so just a quick update between the activities of the BIC Tech Meeting Committee and the BIC workflow. We've standardized the BIC 3T protocol. Our kind of workhorse now is the 32-channel protocol. The field maps, anatomical, functional, DTI have now been bug tested for a year. A lot of that bug testing has been done on the data acquired with the NARC protocol, which is going on 200-300 subjects at least. Like over 1,000 scans, so we've really kind of beaten these sequences down. So it's not a bad time to consider migrating. If you haven't migrated to BIC sequences already, now's a good time to consider it because they're quite well tested. In addition, we are ramping up the 7T BIC protocol, which is in some sense even more exciting than the BIC 3T protocol because it makes accessible 7T imaging, which historically has just been hard for a lot of places. So now we have standardized sequences. That process is led by Rafa Hulleran with some help from myself, using MP2 Rage, which is we're not going to talk about this at length, but it's basically it's an anatomical sequence that helps that gets you T1 mapping as well as control for a lot of the intensity artifacts that you see at 7T. We also have multi-echo fMRI, which helps significantly reduce the artifacts and distortion seen in 7T fMRI, and we also have DTI using the HCP sequence. Again, based on the work by the by BIC and its collaborators, especially on Vivora. We have software packages, all the major software packages used in neuroimaging installed on Minerva. So if you get a Minerva account and you log in and you type module load AFNI or module load FSL, that's the only command you need to run to get access to all the software and the latest version of it that's been tested. Which means that, you know, if you guys are considering like installing all the software on your own computers, there's nothing wrong with that, but you know, if you think that's the only way to do it, that's not. Getting your data onto Minerva and loading these packages that are already installed and tested there is, you know, an important way, you know, an important resource that's available to you. You know, we have big plans for 2016 in terms of ramping up basically web-enabled analysis platforms, starting with tools that will actually help you guys get your raw and pre-processed data off of Minerva, off of our basically backends in a really convenient way. That'll, I think, make the big services really much more, you know, what they are and how they make our lives easier and much more clear. But more on that in March. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand off to Tom first. Yes.
So I will wind up speaking on behalf of everybody who winds up servicing the data that you wind up bringing in. And I speak from the experience of sort of the underneath of all the bruising that goes on, coordinating all the spreadsheets that come back from the weight of the secondary data that we get as we're doing this kind of work. And so in addition to the imaging that we, you know, concentrate on and think of natively, we also collect an awful lot of metadata that we wind up using to make sense of all the functional aspects of what we're doing. And that can actually come out to be a substantial amount of weight. The labor sharing costs that can go into that can be very expensive, although not upfront, not dollar costs per se, but they come back and bite us in a lot of different ways. In an up-and-coming perspective, the data integrity, the compliance, the provenance of where the data came from, how they came to be, how they can be replicated, how they can be retrieved, is becoming more and more of an issue, and it's becoming more and more difficult to do in the traditional passing around spreadsheet model of doing things. And so spreadsheet proliferation is a, you know, particular curse that we don't really need to keep dealing with, and I'm going to try and give a little bit of an introduction. I suspect most of you have not yet gotten to take a look at REDCap or gotten to the point where it seems like it might be worth doing. And so I'll give you sort of a, you know, scout's perspective on it. I can't say that this reflects a lot of expertise yet, but it really is a very powerful platform for, you know, simplifying some of the problems that come up. And Mount Sinai is very much behind this. They run workshops on a quarterly basis now. People are starting to get emails, and they really have a very good support office over there. Maria Supran in particular seems to just really love supporting this package, and they want the biostatistics department to be in a position where their consulting and their support for people's analyses start from a place where the data are very well standardized and the access is not slowing things down and running up the consulting difficulty. And so, you know, our enterprise is actually sort of a starship-shaped kind of thing. We make our observations, we try and do some analyses, we get some findings. The funding comes in as a result of that, lets us do some more observations. We concentrate on our neuroimaging. It seems like that's really, you know, the mass of what we're doing, but in fact, we're collecting physiology, surveys, backgrounds, behavioral tasks, and each of these things wind up generating, you know, into the thousands of variables for most of us. And then we compound that by offloading it to a variety of assistants and collaborators, each of whom typically jump right into thinking, I can put this into a spreadsheet. The spreadsheets wind up proliferating, getting passed around. They go through an evolutionary process is gentle, a mutation process is probably closer to what really happens. And then as analysis comes to, you know, become frustrating, you have a process of having to reconcile all the differences that have crept into things. And it is really much better for people to all be able to start from a well-structured starting place. And that's what REDCap is endeavoring to do. And so we all know this, but it is worth not feeling like it's just, you know, me complaining about it. This is an industry-wide problem everywhere on the internet. People have discovered that they're really hurting themselves by this proliferation of spreadsheets. And there are businesses, we've all sort of encountered Google Docs and Google Sheets as an attempt to do away with all of the different version control and revision levels of getting our data back. And it is very important and consequential, in part because when it goes wrong, it runs up in the business world into $100 million lawsuits because the data are bad. In our case, it may be that things don't replicate or we can't explain where these numbers came from. And so NIH is very interested in making sure that as they know people are going through this, that provenance becomes more and more of an issue in people being able to demonstrate how the data flowed on the way to getting into the publications. All right? So really, it's a nightmare that has a nice ending to it if we take advantage of some of the tools that are available. And REDCap is a mature and very well-developed product of Vanderbilt University. It's been around for many years now. It's in use worldwide. There's a consortium of REDCap sites, and each of them wind up providing their own local hosting of the server. So it's not cloud-based in the negative sense where when it goes down, nobody can do anything. You can't get a hold of tech support. You can't understand. They don't know your local issues. And so it's really a very nice hybrid where the development is very well centralized, but the support is local to the institutions that need to use it. And so they can become familiar with the benefits and the problems that are specific to the site. It also means that the IRB has a chance to get familiar with it. And so part of the sales pitch that the statistics group does when they're trying to get people on board to use REDCap is that the IRB is familiar with it. They recognize it as legitimate and safe cloud installation for capturing data. There's also a very large library that has grown because it's a worldwide consortium, and so there are many, many different instruments that are already developed inside of it that people can pick up and make use of. And so what it looks like is a login. It's a secure process. You have to file for an account with biostatistics here, and you go through a login process that will take you to an orientation page that is full of text offering to be helpful. It's a system that really wants to nurture people's development of it. And so they embed little question marks for context-sensitive help. They put in paragraphs of background on material. They really don't want you to feel, at sea while you're trying to work with this. And so they're very determined to help train users. And they use a dashboard model, which shows up in many different ways because they know that people don't live in this thing every day. They come back to it after a couple of months and they need orientation to it. And so it is organized with many dashboards. They adapt as you're moving through different sections of it so that you have help in many different ways while you're trying to develop things. So what I will do here is just go through a few screens, get you oriented to some of the things that are, superficially evident and available for constructing surveys. And then we've been working to develop a set of common demographic variables for BIC studies so that at some point in the future, not to be redundant with what researchers are already collecting, but to centralize it so that when you're collecting your demographics, ethnic background, gender, there's one place to put it in and it's getting coded in a consistent format. When it comes time to archive out the data for sharing, things will be in place. Investigators won't get all these, urgent deadline memos that we need to have an explanation for what your data field 13 means. And so, as an example of the way that the layout works when you're creating variables, they have a designer that starts very simple and then becomes more and more complicated as you dig into it. And it provides a number of very helpful things, again, getting back to the IRB being comfortable with things. This first example that I put was medical record number. That's very sensitive, that's very HIPAA worrisome. The IRB would really get mad about that. They are able to do this in part because REDCap has a specific field set aside for every variable that you put into the database as to whether or not it's an identifier. And they have routines so that when the data get exported, it gets anonymized automatically inside the software. And so they have checks in there anticipating HIPAA issues, anticipating privacy issues. And so it spares a lot of the grief of having to design it for each and every instrument as you do inside your own project. Some of the other things that come along with this are the ability, as you're collecting the data, you're doing away with the data entry step. And so there's no more harvesting data from some instrument so that it can then be imported into some other instrument. The person who's actually filling out a REDCap survey is also doing the data entry for you, and the data entries can be validated online. And so it is possible to set up checks and conditions to flag impossible values, give feedback to the subject, restrict to particular types of data within a field, limits and ranges within a field. And then there are other tools that we become used to avoid typos. You can have drop-down lists, radio buttons, checkboxes. And so you can really structure the data to be convenient for the subject and also to protect the standardization and the uniformity of the data that come in. The other thing that it can do is online, very quick decision making. And so you can program in rules as to how the survey should progress. And you can build very dynamic surveys in which you can have gender-specific questions come up once the subject has identified their gender. Other subjects can skip over them, and the software also recognizes that there was a branching occurred and that the data do not exist for that field because it's not relevant for that gender. And you have your choice of being able to become a wizard and do things algebraically. You can write the logical statements yourself, but they also provide a lot of builders. You can drag and drop variables. They really, again, have gone out of their way to make it convenient for people to make use of. And so if I had a keyboard and I could log in, I would go to a live survey and we could go through some of what it does. This survey, again, is part of, it's an early effort to develop a standardized core set of demographic variables so that we would know what has gone into things. And in the world of data sharing, if you have not yet run across NIH's insistence on common data elements, there are a number of ontologies that NIH recommends people refer to that have already established definitions of sets of variables. And again, as the data goes out to be shared, it greatly reduces the amount of work in recoding your data to be compatible with things. And so the Phoenix CD ontology is very complete and has a lot of existing tools already. And so we've been making use of that. What a subject would see would be an internet link, and hopefully the internet will work on this machine. But that's a big hope. And so connectivity in the cloud age is always a requirement. Yep, we had it, and I messed it up. And it is a security issue, but I do want to proceed. This is artificially awful because it's a shared computer. If you were, in fact, using your own computer, if you had a tablet, and you brought it and it was connected, you would just have subjects filling things out directly. And so what happens is that REDCap delivers URLs, and then the experimenters' projects can do all sorts of things with them. You can recode them to English language things. You can assemble a package of URLs to give a subject a flow for the day. There are a lot of possibilities come along with it. But once they have established the routine, they can start filling in data. There are a number of shortcuts that they provide when you're working with dates. They recognize that. They will let you have a pop-up calendar. You don't have to program that yourself. You can put in today's value very easily. And then subjects can head through this, and I won't make you just enjoy watching me type badly, because very shortly we'll start getting into some of the conditional examples. And so if I am a male subject and continue on, I have a next page waiting for me. If I were a female subject and able to operate a mouse, I would have a variety of other questions that would be relevant for collecting the demographics. And so the survey has this integral branching coded into it to make these adaptations. And the algebra that is available inside the survey definitions goes into the point where you can also come up with scoring rules so that you can actually have it doing some scoring of your data as well if you're able to work out, a simple enough algebraic combination for it. Radio buttons, checkboxes, more checkboxes, radio buttons. You're able to assemble the questions where it's appropriate into compact grids. Subjects tend to find this less awful than having an endless questionnaire that's just repeating the same format 35 times. And so the ability to grid this stuff can actually be very helpful. This is getting into socioeconomic information, and so if you want to play with this afterwards, we can go back. This has a number of branches. Depending on income level, the questions will adapt and probe deeper as people report different brackets of income. You're able to embed images into the surveys as well. In this case, we might be interested in the color blindness of the subject. Typically, they would go through a series of 6 plates. If they get them all right, we know they're not colorblind. If they get one wrong, the survey will plug in 2 more. And so we can boost the confidence that we've really, that we have really examined their color vision pretty comprehensively. And so questionnaires, the branching continues, and I can send the link out at the end, and people can, play with this. If you give us a little feedback on what you find either helpful or not helpful, or if you have any questions, it would be great to know about it so that we can make this as meaningful as quickly as possible. And I think the rest of this is just more examples of branching. And so to finish up, REDCap also makes it very easy to take the next step after you've collected the data. And they make an API available so that there's a programmable interface. Tools like XNet, tools like other database systems will, we believe, we haven't gotten to the point where we've actually implemented this yet, be able to query data out of the REDCap database, plug data into the REDCap database. And so it has the potential to become a very integral part of some of the packages that we're developing to make the processing as transparent for people as possible. One of the things that it provides that is a very great service is both a data dictionary and a code book, so that when you do have collaborations and you do go out for consultations, you don't have to go through a separate process of compiling the meaning of the different variables, filtering the variables. It does this natively, and it gives a completely comprehensive listing of the features of the variables so that other people can replicate a system to receive them and to understand how to process them. A few resources at the end. These PowerPoints, I guess, are going to be up on the website. The video will be up on the website, and people can do it. Evie Andreopoulos is the new local administrator. Maria Supran is now, I guess, bumped up to be the project manager for REDCap. And Maria has just been completely amazingly deep in understanding how the system works. She's very quick and she's very helpful at getting answers when there are things. They have a probably filled information session coming up on the 29th. If you are interested, they're using REDCap for their attendance registration. We're also using REDCap for those of you who filled out the survey to tell us more about your study. That's a REDCap survey as well, to give you a flavor of what it is like to interact with the thing. And some background reading if you're not starting to follow the common data elements and the RDoc requirements that we're going to need to be working in for the data sharing. And the wiki entry for REDCap actually gives a very reassuring history of how long this thing has been developed and how broadly used it is. So with that, I'll stop.
Okay, this is the non-tech development part of the talk. I would like to preface this by saying, obviously, I'm not speaking to any of you. You all check your data regularly, and you don't need this. So I'm talking to the imaginary people in the room who have acquired an entire data set and looked at it later. But I think actually I can totally admit that I've been here and acquired a bunch of data and then found that my field maps were all wrong, for example. So I'll be the first to admit that this has affected me. So I just want to talk very briefly about a couple of BIC tools and your own take on how maybe you might want to take a look at your data and a few common artifacts. And I'm going to really whip through this because most of it's not new, and I'm sure if you've done an MRI course, you've heard it before. The first thing to know is if you want to know how to get hold of your data, we gave a whole workshop on this sometime last year called So I Scanned Someone, Now What? And that can be found on the BIC User Workshops page of the BIC website, where you just have to log in to find it. And I highly recommend that you go there if you missed that. But if you do watch that, then you'll know that your data live, at least initially, in XNAT. And so if you want to find your data and make sure that they are there, which would probably be the first step for checking your data, then you need to go into XNAT and locate yourself to your project. Now you need to do this within a reasonable amount of time, probably a couple of days after your data are acquired. Otherwise, they don't live on the scanner computer anymore. They're gone forever and you've lost them. So this is really the first part of checking your data. You really should check that it's in XNAT. And no one else is responsible for this other than the person whose project it is. So no one else is going to do this for you. So you can find your project in the Projects tab here, and then there's a list of your projects that will appear below after you've logged in. So to have a look at the data that are in your project, just select the project. Again, if you want more info on this, you can go to the previous workshop. And at this point, you might want to add some of the pipelines that we're going to talk about. So very briefly, you can do that from within each project. You can go to the Pipelines tab. There'll be a list of the pipelines that are currently assigned to you. So here are some pipelines that are currently assigned to me. As you can see, I don't use many because I scan mostly non-human subjects. And you can check here to add more pipelines, and it will give you a list of the possible pipelines that you can find. So we're not going to cover all the pipelines today. Some of them are pre-processing pipelines, some of them are data analysis pipelines. But I do just want to mention this one, the DICOM to NIFTY converter. So this is something that you can use to convert all of your data from a particular scan session or from a particular project into NIFTY format and put it on Minerva. So this is one quick and easy way to get your data. And what I'm talking about here is the very most basic form of your data. So it's practically the raw data. It's the DICOM files themselves that have been converted to NIFTYs, which is something you can open with pretty much any MRI package of your choice. And that's the level of checking your data I'm talking about. Another way to grab your data, if you don't currently have a Minerva account or you don't want to use Minerva, is to grab the raw data by going into one of the scan sessions, going to Manage Files right here, getting a list of the files, checking or unchecking the ones that you want and don't want, and then downloading them directly onto your local machine, and then converting them locally using any DICOM to NIFTY converter software that you like. This session's a bit too short for me to do any tutorials in any of those things. So I'll just mention that there are many. There's a nice one that I've been using recently called MRI Crow GL, which both has a graphical user interface and has some code associated with it. Okay, once you have it, look at it. What do I mean by that? Just physically eyeball every volume that you collected to see if it looks screwed up or not. So here's an example of how you might do that. So this is FSL view. I like to use FSL when I'm looking at my data. Open up your data file. So this is raw diffusion data. So this is volume by volume data. Thanks to Raf for this. This is a particularly beautiful 7T data set. All you need to do to look at your data is go hit the movie button. Windows to Mac issues. Let's try it like this. Really? Oh, well, that's disappointing. Okay, you'll have to come and find me later if you want to see this. It was gorgeous. You've got to hit the movie button, which is right here. And it will scroll through your data volume by volume. Luckily for this demonstration, you do not need to scroll through volume by volume. I just sit with some music on in the background and I watch my data through like a movie, so that I can see if there are any gross artifacts. And so I think you'll probably be able to see from this next example that this diffusion data set is not perfect. Okay, so you can even see that from the first volume, from the first no diffusion weighted volume here. There's definitely something going on here, and it's actually present in every single volume, but in this case you don't even need to do that. The number of people who might get a few steps down the road before they see that is quite high. And so it might be that when you go further and analyze the data, so here we might want to fit a diffusion tensor model to the data. Ooh. Yeah, we're not getting any movies today. Then you might see something that looks kind of messed up here and that has really odd fractional anisotropy values in those areas where you have poor data. So I think it's really important just to take a very cursory look at your data and make sure that you don't have any of these things going on. So I'm just going to whip through some common examples. Oh, and this is what a good 3T data set should look like, just for comparison. Thanks to Emma for some of these data. Okay, so what kind of issues can you see here? Well, obviously one big worry is that you might see a neurological issue with one of your subjects. So this is another scan that Emma gave me. Here you can see already there's enlargement in the ventricles here. There's a lot of hypersignal right here. And that's translating through into the FA image, which we have some really odd FA values going on here. So you can see that both in the raw data and in the processed data. So you should probably check both stages. Oh, here's another one with a more focal, looks like it might be a lesion going on here. And again, that's leading to a massive decrease in FA signal in this scan here. So that's another possible artifact that you could see. You might see eddy current issues. These might manifest themselves as these movements in the data. You might see, oh, I wish this one would play because you do actually need to see the movie for this one. But I don't think it's fated to be, so I'll just skip to the next slide. Here, okay, so that was supposed to show you a nice movie showing some really fabulous radio frequency noise that was occurring. So that can look a bit like this sort of stripiness here on the signal, or it can look like this really like horrendous artifact here. I've definitely encountered people who've analyzed whole data sets and their brains have looked like they're going through some kind of disco. And it's been because of RF noise. And this sort of thing it's completely, you can't fix it in post-processing. So it's really important to look for it. Originally, aliasing here, so you've got part of the brain overlapping with itself, so that's not great. I should say that I stole a lot of these slides, borrowed a lot of these slides from the UCLA and FSL imaging courses. So if you want to learn more, you can visit those pages. Croxson's favorite, the clipping artifacts. This is where you have such high signal that the amplifier reaches its limit and it cuts off everything above that limit and basically gives it a value of 0, leading to all these black areas. This is rescuable if you still have the raw data, that is the data before it's been converted into DICOM format. But if you don't, there's nothing you can do about it and you need to fix something in your sequence. You've probably all seen susceptibility and dropout artifacts, and you might want to fix, for example, your slice angle or something like that before you proceed with a whole group of subjects with an artifact as big as this one. Ghosting can be problematic, but not so much if you can manage to get it outside the brain. So there are things you can do about this even if you can't get rid of it. And this is really common in EPI sequences. You also see it with movement. And so if you have excessive subject movement, that's another thing you might want to look for. That's another slide saying the same thing. Then probably all of you have experienced some form of distortion. It gets much worse with higher field strength. Again, that's something that can be corrected for, but it's good to know if you have it or not and to think about it ahead of time. And it can differ depending on the phase encode direction. We can use that to correct for it. RF bias or B1 inhomogeneity, also correctable for, but another possible artifact. Mark Cohen at the UCLA imaging course calls this parasitic conduction. I call this a bit of metal on your subject somewhere that's causing this. I particularly like this one where the hair tie with a bit of metal on it causes the back of the head to be pulled down into the neck there in MRI space. Okay, I said this before, I'll say it again. When should you do this? After you acquire your very first scan, I would run it through, I would look at it, I would run it through your entire pre-processing pipeline, and I would make sure it works. You should probably do it after every scan before you acquire the next one, if you're being really honest with yourself, but I would definitely do it after you acquire the first scan. Why? Because sometimes you cannot get those data back, and there's nothing you can do about it. In addition, you should probably keep checking your data visually before and after pre-processing steps, before and after registration and normalization, which is something that Emma's seen a lot of issues with and picked up because she checks her data. So there are a number of places where you should do this, and I think that no automated tool can substitute for this, essentially. And there's a list here of the artifacts that I discussed, which you can pick up on the website once we put the slides up, suggesting which of them are recoverable and dealable with in post-processing and which of them are not. And some of them are at the individual subject level, so you might just want to exclude the subject if you have excessive motion, for example. But there are other cases in which you might actually really want to take a look at your sequence or even the scanner hardware to see if you are having issues. And so that's definitely something to seek advice from, and that's something that BIC personnel can help you with. Okay.
For the sake of time, I had wanted to show you a movie of what some of the artifacts look like, but we might be running a little. Yeah, well, made an effort. So many of you, possibly all of you, are acquiring fMRI for various reasons. And as you also may have heard or know very well, fMRI is very susceptible to artifacts, just as much as structural imaging is. Although fMRI artifacts a lot of times can go unnoticed because fMRI is a time by volume sequence. So a lot of times you may look at the first volume and it looks okay, and then you kind of move on. But it's really vital to actually play the data. So what are the various, there's numerous physical sources of artifact and fMRI data. One is the effective magnetic susceptibility due to an air sinus, kind of a tissue air boundary, instrumental error. So basically there's some noise generation in the equipment itself. Acceleration due to, artifacts due to a mode that the sequence is running in, for example, with high acceleration. So if you accelerate the sequence, most of the time there's a trade-off in terms of signal quality. A susceptibility-induced magnetic field, which leads to distortion of the image. And the biggest one, and the one that most of you would I would recommend be most wary of, is subject motion. But these are the actual kind of physical sources of artifact. These manifest in the time series in interesting ways. So from simply a data, like how these artifacts manifest in the data, they can manifest as spikes in the time series, distortion or shearing of the images, signal dropout, of course, affecting the orbitofrontal inferior temporal lobes, thermal noise, which is basically just Gaussian noise in the data, scanner drift, checkering artifacts, image blurring, geometric distortion. So these are all the things that can happen. And what I wanted to show is a video of, let's see if this actually works. No, it doesn't. But if we had, so this is AFNI viewing a fMRI data set. You can get a similar view in FSL, but the point is get a view where you can see the graph and get a view where you can see the image. And what you'll see is, especially if you have signal modulations that look like this, you should basically jump to these frames and see how the images are affected. So in this particular data set, this brain would be basically jumping up and down by about 1 to 3 millimeters, maybe more, and you see all sorts of weird banding artifacts. And if you see anything over time, if this image basically moves and deforms and shows any kind of artifact over time, it's something you should be mindful of and kind of track that. So what I'll in the rest of this, in the next few slides, I'll just show you some tools that you can use that will help you flag the data sets that might be affected by these artifacts. Okay, so fMRI data sets are big, they're complicated, they can have lots of artifacts, but when push comes to shove, there's basically 3 metrics that you should be mindful of, 3 numbers. One is called temporal signal-to-noise ratio. It's a measure of the stability of the signal in a voxel. Its TSNR is computed as the signal mean divided by the standard deviation. That is the mean signal divided by how much it varies. That basically in a good data set, that value is about 100, right? And this metric is computed at every voxel, so you can actually make a map of TSNR. So the lower your TSNR, the more variability you have in your time series. That variability may be coming from like thermal noise, or it may be coming from the fact that you have a lot of nuisance variation, let's say due to motion or physiological process. Okay, then you have this thing called the DVARS metric. This was kind of recent. This basically, DVARS is a time series measure. So the point of DVARS is to detect the influence of subject head motion on a full fMRI data set. So it basically measures it's computed as taking the first derivative of the time series of all the voxels and computing the root mean square average. So basically, it generates a single time course representing the total amount of shot-to-shot variation. So I'll show you this in a bit. And lastly is the full width half max smoothness of the whole image. That's essentially a single number. So this is, just to review, this is a metric calculated at each voxel. This is a single time series representative of the whole data set, and this is one number to represent the smoothness of the data. So the reason why smoothness of an fMRI data set is important is because for one thing, it tells you what the minimum spatial specificity is of a data set, or at least what the baseline spatial specificity is. But it also says that basically more smooth data are automatically biased to having a higher signal-to-noise ratio. So just because your TSNR is high doesn't mean that's necessarily great. You have to check how smooth the data are, and then you have to base your comparison that way. So a good fMRI data set basically has a high values of TSNR, ideally low values of smoothness, and has basically a relatively flat or invariant DVARS time course. So how does DVARS get calculated? So in an fMRI data set, as I said before, it's a volumetric, so you basically have a volume for every time point. And then if that volume moves around in space, and because it moves around in space, you can compute motion parameters, including the inferior-posterior motion, or the left-right motion, or the anterior-posterior motion, and also yaw, pitch, and roll, which are rotations. You can compute the first derivative of the fMRI signal time series and take their RMS average, and you can actually, based on whatever data treatment you use, let's say raw or after preprocessing, the raw here is the black trace. It basically shows you that when you have moments of head motion, that generates basically a transient large-scale variation in your data set. So it's a big signal change occurring all throughout the brain corresponding to a point of motion. As the subject's head motion in a period of a scan gets more intense, the DVARS measure will also get, the DVARS trace will also get more intense, and that indicates that the signal in that time period is less usable. And if you can summarize the DVARS trace by taking the median or kind of a higher percentile, and that's generally indicative of the amount of motion-related variance you have in your data set. So thanks to the work by Chen Yang, we have a functional data quality control mechanism now built into XNAT. So after acquiring a dataset, an fMRI dataset, you can run a auto quality control pipeline. And after you run it, you will have this kind of matrix available in the XNAT view of the dataset. The way to run that is after you have enabled the pipeline in XNAT for your project, you go to build, you go to build, select the functional QC pipeline, hit submit, and then when you hit submit, you'll actually get a form where you can basically enter the scans that you want the quality control to be run for. You hit submit, and after hitting submit, you get that matrix. So one of the things that's available is actually an image viewer on XNAT directly. So you can actually load up an image in XNAT, and you can click on the image, and it'll blow it up on your screen. And if there are any major image artifacts, you can actually see it right on the website. And so after the functional QC pipeline is run, the first thing you can get is a TSNR map viewer, right? So this is a voxel by voxel map of the TSNR. So if you have, for whatever reason, a local variation, a local decrease of SNR, that means that there's an artifact that may have happened, and you can get to this view by hitting the montage. When this is hidden, it says view. When this is shown, it says hide. So under montage, hit that button, and you'll actually get this viewer right online after you've run the functional QC pipeline. And then you have, for each functional data set that you've selected to run the QC pipeline on, it actually generates these metrics, these traces online for you to inspect. So you have a DVARS trace, and then you also have the actual metrics of head motion, including mean absolute displacement, and also you also have the trace of the smoothness as it varies over time. So let me go back. So you can basically, I would particularly recommend inspecting the full width half max, the DVARS mean, the DVARS second moment, and the higher the DVARS second moment is, the more affected by motion you are. And the real outlier data sets, you need to actually go ahead and download those data sets, load up FSL View or AFNI, and begin playing those data sets and inspecting what happened. That may lead to a decision of rejecting the data set, or it may lead to contacting one of us to kind of ask for advice on how to clean it up if we can. So that is available right now for people to use. And if you take away nothing else from this talk, and if you're not immediately able to use some sort of Nifty viewer or processing viewer, start using at least the XNAT interface as soon as you've acquired the data. And you can actually use the viewer the XNAT viewer to view the data without downloading any software. So general recommended usage, use the XNAT viewer for anatomical data sets and spot major artifacts. So that means when using the BIC sequences, if you've acquired an anatomical, you can, in your sequence list, you can actually go to the T1 weighted NP-RAGE BIC. You can click on the plus and you get an image. Click on that image, it'll actually blow up on your screen in your browser, and you can actually physically look at it. If you see ghosting or weird local dropouts, anything that Paula indicated, right away you know something's wrong, and then you can kind of go through the rest of the data sets and inspect. And I would suggest as soon as you acquire your fMRI data sets, start running your automated quality control, get those metrics, spot data sets that have abnormally high values of DVARS or low values of SNR. Look at the SNR maps as well, and look at the smoothness values. Again, and then I would suggest using SNR and DVARS to flag problematic fMRI data sets, and if they're particularly high, download them to Minerva or your computer and inspect them. And then lastly, consider having data quality metrics as covariates in your analysis downstream, because these kind of problems in the raw data translate to the metric you draw at the end. Whether it may be an artifactual positive, false positive, or you might even have false negatives. All right, so with that, I guess I'll conclude. We'll take questions, if there are any.
Can you give some examples of quality metrics included as covariates, except for head movements, which are very often included?
So, I mean, basically the head movement, the SNR, and so there's kind of various levels of doing this. So for example, let's say you have a task-based fMRI study. You have some sort of average beta computed in an activation, and you have put this in a spreadsheet. You've got one number per subject. If you then have a TSNR metric or you have a DVARS metric, you basically compute a correlation, but regress out that factor, regress out the factor of TSNR DVARS first, and then not first, but like include that in your model basically. More sophisticated ways of handling this is using mixed effects meta-analysis. So that's a way of doing a general linear model. And voxel, basically, you know, if you're doing a t-test analysis on an fMRI data set, you usually just include the betas, the activation magnitudes. So in a mixed effects meta-analysis, you can provide both the betas and the t-maps from the subject level. And so in the group level GLM, it'll be able to factor out voxel by voxel the effect of varying t-statistics, the varying significance. So those are a couple of examples, but I think it's just, in a basic sense, it's good to just grab the DVARS values, the SNR values, and just as a sanity check, include them as covariates in downstream analyses to protect yourself against false positives. Yeah.
So I have a question. I may have missed this, but is there any list available on the website with like specific cutoffs for when an image is beyond like?
Right. So we don't have the reference values for things like DVARS or TSNR because it's sequence dependent. So that being said, our BIC sequences are standardized, so we'll work on getting some basic references out. But just as a kind of rule of thumb, a TSNR of 80 is considered kind of okay, given the BIC sequence. Higher is obviously better. If your TSNRs are looking like 30 or 40, chances are you'll notice that your DVARS values are very high as well. So that's basically, that sums up into a picture of like just a data set that's affected badly by motion. Otherwise, look at the actual images, and if you see any major artifacts like clear image distortions, you need to bring that to us, and we can work with you.
There's a publication from HCP with a very similar sequence as the BIC sequence, which do provide numbers.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, that's right. Thanks. That's right.
So in fMRI, how often do you just have one volume that's bad? And if so, can you just throw that volume out and reconstruct the data without?
If you have,
Or is that not really recommended?
so I guess what you're talking about is scrubbing, right? So that's basically what it's called. So it's this process of if you have an fMRI time series and if you have one or more single